This conversation is part of the James J. Blanchard Living Library of Michigan Political History, a project of the Michigan Political History Society. Hello, my name is Lynn Jondahl, and I'm here on behalf of the Michigan Political History Society. I'm here to talk with the Honorable Dennis Archer. Justice Archer has served on the Michigan Supreme Court. He has been mayor of the city of Detroit, and he's been a key figure in Michigan political history since the 1960s. Thank you, Justice Archer, for giving us this time today. I'm looking forward to the conversation with you. Pleased to be here.
Thank you.
And here we are sitting in your office in Detroit.
Yes.
And I think you were born in Detroit, right?
I was born in Detroit. I lived here for 5 years, and then I went with my parents to Cassopolis, Michigan. That's Cassopolis.
Okay.
Population 1,500.
1500.
And
How old were you then?
5. And I started the first grade in Cassopolis, and when I graduated from high school, I came back to the city of Detroit to live with my grandmother while I started Wayne State University. And ultimately left Wayne State University and went to Western Michigan University, where I graduated. And that's sort of been the first part of the academic endeavors.
What took your family to Cassopolis?
I was here because my mother brought me here because there was no hospital in Cassopolis. And I was born in the city of Detroit, lived here for 5 years, and then went back to Cassopolis. Conceived in Cassopolis, born in Detroit, and went back to grow up in Cassopolis.
Okay. And then went back to Western after starting out here.
Well,
I say back, Cassopolis is
well,
kind of over
they're
there.
very close. That is to say, for those who are not familiar with Cassopolis, it's about 24 miles from South Bend, Indiana, 14 miles from Niles, 7 miles from Vandalia, and it's about 4 miles from Vandalia, 37 from Three Rivers, and about 50-some from Kalamazoo. It's in that pocket.
So if I were talking today to people who knew your family in Cassopolis or knew you at Western or knew you later in law school or as a teacher, would I be talking to a bunch of people who are amazed and surprised at what you have done?
I think so, because I frankly had no idea what I was going to do when I was growing up in Cassopolis. Fact of the matter, in the first 5 years, as you might imagine, a youngster loving to play and enjoying himself with peers and others, used to hate to take a bath. When I went to Cassopolis, we didn't have any running water. And so I took a bath in a metal tub every Saturday night. And we couldn't get a glass of water when you go to the faucet, etc. And so you can also imagine the follow-up, that is to say that there was no indoor facilities. So we had a honey pot for the nighttime and outdoor facilities for during the day, whether it happens to be 90 degrees or 40 below wind chill factor.
So you lived there essentially through high school, from
Yes.
All the way from kindergarten through high school.
Yes.
The came here then for your high school, here being Detroit, for your high school, or when you started law school, or
No,
undergraduate school at Wayne.
That's right.
Okay.
I did. And my dad had a third grade education. He lost his arm just above his left elbow in a car accident before I was born. My mother had a high school diploma. Neither one had ever stepped foot on a college campus.
Okay.
But they made it very clear to me when I was growing up that I was going to go to college. They couldn't tell me where to go. They couldn't suggest what college I ought to go to, what I ought to do or want to dream about becoming as a professional. but I was going to go to college, and so I started working when I was 8 years old. My first job was a caddy on a golf course, Park Shore, 9-hole golf course at the time. Now it's up to 27, I believe, 27 holes.
Have you played it since?
Oh, yes. And I set pins in our bowling alley before it shut down, and then worked in our bakery, worked for a interior decorator who used to be a tremendous artist, but put his art into metal. His name was Edwin Johnson, and I went to school with his son Winston, and then I started working for Winston's dad just as I was almost ready to graduate. After I graduated, I lied about my age to work in a furniture factory in Cassopolis, and they found out, less than a month that I was too young. And they promptly did the right thing. They fired me. And I came back to Detroit to start Wayne State University, but I needed money to be able to go to college. So I started working for a real estate company. And then from a real estate company, working for them, I was painting houses. And if you can remember oil-based paint, and think about oil-based paint in the summer and painting closets and getting up on ladders and painting the eaves, troughs, etc., paint coming down your arm, etc. Went through all of that. My first white-collar job was working after school, after college. I go to college during the day, and then in the evening, I worked about 3 or 4 hours at Henry Ford Hospital for the medical records department. And when I started Wayne State University, I went in to see a counselor. The counselor said, "What do you want to be?" I did not have a clue. I mean, my parents didn't suggest, "Why don't you do this, or why don't you think about that?" But I was impressed with the pharmacist whose drugstore I was working for, being a stock boy. And so I said I want to be a pharmacist. Well, the school system, Cassopolis, was a Class C school, meaning that it's Class C means it's a smaller school in size than a Class A school, which Lansing, Sexton, and all of the larger schools around the state or in Detroit would be Class A. Class C was small. And the only thing we did in chemistry was to make oxygen. So I said pharmacy. And it didn't take but about 1.5 years for me and pharmacy not to agree.
Yes.
So I ventured off and took a short step to the Detroit Institute of Technology. And it dawned on me, with a degree in arts and sciences, I couldn't imagine what job I would have with that kind of degree. So I went up to Western Michigan University, and first time I ever lived away from home, and stayed in the only dorm that did not serve food. It's called Vandercook Hall. That's where a lot of the athletes stayed and the like. We affectionately referred to it as Hungry Hall. And I went over to see a counselor, and he said, "What do you want to do?" Well, by that time I'd met some friends who were teachers, and I was impressed with their infatuation with the profession, the excitement that they had in working with their students. So I said, "I'd like to be a high school history teacher." He said, "I'd like for you to think about it, because we've got so many high school history teachers in our state today that you would be lucky to be able to be hired in a junior high setting to teach history. Why don't you think about it?" So I said, okay. I went back to the dorm, and my roommate was not there, but he had a stack of letters like that from school districts from all over the state. So I asked around the dorm and said, "My roommate is George Waters. He's got all of these letters from, what's his major?" Said he's special education. And it was special education for the educable mentally retarded. Today we refer to our students as learning disabled. So I asked more about it, and the more I asked, the more I became excited about it. So I went back to see the counselor, and then I got into that program and just took off, and I really enjoyed it. So I graduated from Western Michigan University, came back to Detroit, and started teaching in our Detroit public schools
In special ed.
in special ed.
That would have been then just shortly after Michigan adopted special education legislation, as am I recalling correctly? And I hear the story that the advocates, parents, and so on of special ed students wanted assurance of a program which the legislature enacted but didn't fund, and so they had to come back and petition that. So I'm just suggesting you were on in the early days of those curriculum development for special ed.
I can't tell you that I remember. All I know that I wanted to teach. I was happy to graduate from Western Michigan University, and the thought of making some real money
Okay.
was something that was sort of preeminent in my mind and working with young people rather than the history which gave rise to it. I graduated in 1965 from Western Michigan University. So I don't know the timing of all of that. And I started, well, I was at Bunch Elementary and
In Detroit.
in Detroit, and the principal, Violet Vardy, suggested that the way I work with students and the way I work with my fellow teachers, that in her view, I had the makings of being a very fine principal. And in order for me to be able to move in that direction, I would have to get a master's degree in education. So I started down at the Rackham Building at the University of Michigan's off campus to start taking 2 courses to move towards getting a master's degree. And ironically, the first 2 classes that I took, I found that I was using the same 2 textbooks that I used as an undergraduate at Western Michigan University. And so I was dating this teacher at the time, and I started complaining, some might say whining,
She might say one.
about taking the classes, and I wasn't frankly learning anything new, nothing new by way of thoughts, strategy, rationale, etc. And the more I complained, she started saying, "Why don't you go to law school?" And I just said, "Look, I've never been in a lawyer's office. I don't know what lawyers do. I don't have a clue of what they do." And I would say no. She would say, "You ought to think about it." And I thought about it, and I took the LSAT exam. And the score suggested that if I went to law school and worked hard, I could graduate from law school. And so I went to law school.
This then all the way through your undergraduate and your professional education program, graduate program, you were working at the same time
Yes.
in a full-time job.
I worked part-time when I was at Wayne State. I worked part-time when I was at Detroit Institute of Technology. When I transferred up to Western Michigan University, I worked part-time there too. I was washing pots and pans.
Oh, okay.
And in a dorm that allowed us to eat
Oh, because you
at
were
the
in
meal
in
that
the
we watched.
non-eating dorm.
Thank you
Yes.
very much. That allowed us to eat the meal we served. So I ate dinner, served I worked at the dinner meal, washing pots and pans, and on Sundays, because it was they really sort of didn't need you. There would be a group of us who lived in Vandercook who went to Walgreens downtown, and they had a brunch, all you can eat. And so we all saved up to make sure that we could go down there and eat. And as we finished, we sort of loaded up our plates again with things that we could put in a napkin that wouldn't cause grease stains in our pockets and the like, and apples or whatever they might have, so that would have a little something later for the day.
All right, all right. Now, up to this point, and you didn't go to law school with the idea this was access to politics or a political career. That was not on your agenda.
I I just knew that a law degree would offer me an opportunity to help people. When I was growing up, we didn't have a television in our home until I think I was a sophomore or a junior in high school. I mean, our entertainment growing up was listening to the radio. When I'm saying our, I'm talking about my dad, mom, and I. I'm the only child. Couldn't afford anybody but me, but we listened to The Shadow and Green Hornet, all the, all the shows that we just enjoyed listening to. And when we got a television, in Cassopolis, we could pick up the South Bend stations. We could pick up one or two Chicago stations and WKZO in Kalamazoo, which was, I think, Channel 3 at the time. And as I was able to watch television, I remember watching on the news this thing called civil rights movement and the marches and the like. I graduated from high school in 1959. I didn't know the significance of it. I just knew that Brown versus the Board of Education was passed by a unanimous Supreme Court in 1954. I didn't follow or know enough about the 1955 decision where the court was entertaining arguments from the lawyers as to how quickly they should implement their 1954 ruling. Of course, they came out with all deliberate speed. Many of us thought that means it was going to be very quick, only it turned out to be very slow, and that was the intent of that decision. And in 1955, I knew that there was a woman who would not get up out of her seat on a bus, and that Rosa Parks was that person. And the civil rights or the bus boycott movement was led by a new minister in town, having been chosen by E.B. Nixon, by the name of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And I think at the time it was just Reverend Martin Luther King, and he picked up his doctorate later. Those vague kinds of things, and remembering the Edmund Pettus Bridge and things like that, but it didn't dawn on me in terms of what the power and majesty of a lawyer or lawyers could do to help change society until I was well into law school. And I taught during the day, and I went to law school at night. And so as opposed to graduating in 3 years, if you go full-time, I graduated in 4 years. And we had a significant number of black law students who were all attending the Detroit College of Law. There were only maybe one or two that were going during the day. Most all of us went at night. And like me, a number were teachers, some were probation officers, some worked in other jobs, but we went to law school at night. And it wasn't until being in law school that I began to have an appreciation for what lawyers can do. I was in law school. The first legal job I had was at the law firm of Keith, Conyers, Brown, Baltimore, and Anderson. The Keith was Damon Keith. And the Conyers was Nathan Conyers, Mike Walls, and Joe Brown, and Herman Anderson, and Joe Baltimore. And that was the summer of 1967. I'd just gotten married on June 17th, and my father-in-law, I went by to pick him up. We went to go play golf, as we would do a lot together. And when we came back, we saw a lot of smoke. Couldn't figure out what the heck was going on. And it was near his house because they lived at, I think, 1642 Longfellow. And so I dropped him off, still couldn't figure out what was going on. Got in the car and drove downtown. My wife and I were living in a Central Park Plaza apartments down here just off of Lafayette, between Lafayette and Larned. And got home and found out that there was a riot in place, that it started as a result of the police going in to break up a blind pig or after hours joint, however you wish to call it. And it was a much larger crowd than they thought. And then they had to call a couple paddy wagons, etc. And then it just erupted. I say all that to suggest that as a result, there were literally thousands of people over the course of several days who were put behind a fence, I think out on Belle Isle. I never went to see it, but I knew that it was someplace, and I think it was on Belle Isle. And the judges called out for all lawyers to please come in and be of help, because people were being detained, and lawyers could, whether you had a practice in criminal law or not, lawyers were trained enough to be able to cause a person to be taken before a judge and being advised what they're charged with, asking for bond, and many people were dismissed or not. There was no one there to make a charge, so case dismissed. Some were charged with disorderly person or whatever they might have been charged with. Well, the Keith Law Firm, because of their experiences, were knee-deep in it. And I saw them render service for people who needed help, who couldn't speak for themselves. It made a very big impression upon me. And then a summer or so later, Don Campbell, who taught contracts at Detroit College of Law, asked me to come up to his office, and he said that Detroit College of Law had been contacted and by Ford Motor Company, the Office of General Counsel. And Ford Motor Company wanted to let it be known or make a statement that they were open to everybody who wanted to come in to be a lawyer for Ford Motor Company, and as a result, wanted to make sure that they had some law students of color. And
Remind me of the year we're talking about.
That would either be 68 or 69. I think it was, well,
just prior to your
I graduated in January of 70.
70.
So I went there and was there for a summer. Fabulous opportunity. I learned a lot. D. Allen Glenn from the University of Michigan was another person of color who worked there for the summer. And he helped me with my writing skills because I just needed the help, and he was kind enough to do that. And when he first started, all I saw was red on the paper, and when we finished, hardly any red on the paper. And then when I graduated in 1970, just before I graduated, I sent a letter in to a very large law firm, and I asked for an opportunity to be interviewed. And I went, before I went to Martindale Hubbell to find out who this person was that was going to be interviewing me and the like. And I went in to see him, and he indicated that he thanked me for coming in, but wanted me to know that the law firm did not hire law students from the Detroit College of Law. I said, thank you very much. all of which I found to be interesting because he graduated from the Detroit College of Law. But as I reflected upon it and asked around a little bit more, I found that when I graduated in 1970, I don't think there was a large law firm in the city of Detroit, if not the state, that had a person of color as an associate or as a partner. So I joined the law firm of Gregg and Gardner, Sam Gardner and Bobby Gregg, and both of which went on to become judges. Sam Gardner, I ran his campaign for Detroit Recorder's Court.
Was that your first campaign in?
No, get to that in a half second. And then the other I helped was J. Robert Gregg was appointed to probate court by the governor. But my first initiation into politics came when my father-in-law and I were playing golf. We were playing at Palmer Park, and happened to run into Harry Philo. Before that, I'd heard a lot about Robert Millender because he, like my father, was in the Army, and they served in Italy. And my father-in-law was very impressed with Robert Millender. Robert Millender was in the only integrated law firm at that time, at least that I knew of. And so I wanted to see if I could impress him. And with the fact that if I were willing to work hard in a campaign, he might translate that into I might be willing to work hard in a law firm, and thus I might have a job after I finished. So in the summer of 1969, I began to work as a volunteer because I lived downtown. I think the office was not too far from Lafayette Park. And I began doing everything that I was asked to do. At the time, we had mimeograph machines, and we would have flyers, 8 by 11, that talked about our candidate, Richard Austin, and we would go out to shopping centers and other places and stick them under windshields, etc. And then,
Was that Austin's first race?
That's Austin's first race for mayor. At the time, he was CPA, and that was in 1969.
Okay.
And so we worked hard on the campaign, and I graduated to being head of the advance team. And I would go, as you know, ahead of the candidate, and when the candidate, Richard Austin, would come, I would tell him how many people were in the room. If there was somebody giving other candidates a hard time or somebody, I'd tell them where that person was situated and the like, and then I left and go to the next place. We watched the election returns in what is now the Book Cadillac downtown. And it was raining, it was cold, and we lost a very close election to Roman Gribbs, who at the time was a sheriff.
Yes, he had been sheriff, or was sheriff at that time, running from that position.
And he was successful. Right after that election, of course, I did not get the job with Bob Millender's law firm. But the next year, Bob Millender called and said, and I was working for Gregg and Gardner, and also left Gregg and Gardner after about 6 months, and the four of us, Elliott Hall, Horace Stone, Alex Allen, and myself, started our own law firm. So the four associates left, the two partners started our own law firm. And then Bob called and said, Dennis, I've got some challenges with my circulation in my leg. We've got a Democratic convention, state Democratic convention in Grand Rapids. It was at the Pentland. And I'd like for you to go up and be my eyes and ears, and I want you to walk and be around Richard Austin. I want you to report into me every day, which I did, because you might remember Secretary of State O'Hare had decided he was not going to run again. And so Bob wisely thought that if Richard Austin could get the nomination, he could win and become Secretary of State, which was a first, I think a first in the nation. And so I went up, and my first time going to a Democratic state convention, and I saw what they meant in the smoke-filled rooms, because I was in there with him late at night and watched him get the nomination, which I reported back to Bob Millender. And then after he successfully got the nomination, I came back to Detroit, and I was asked to help with Wayne, Oakland, and Macomb counties. And then as the race
In the Austin
Secretary of State
campaign.
And then as the race started to tighten up, it was then Wayne County, and then it was the city of Detroit, all at the direction of Bob Millender. And we were very fortunate that Richard Austin won.
Yes.
Bob Millender was an outstanding and brilliant political strategist. And it was just a thrill to work at his direction. And also had a chance to meet another young lawyer at that time by the name of Jim Blanchard.
Mm-hmm.
And in and around about that time, he was either starting or getting ready to help, or was involved with Frank Kelly.
Okay.
And Frank Kelly,
This is Frank Kelly as Attorney General
Yes.
at the time, and Blanchard would have been recently out of law school himself, right?
I would guess that'd be about right. And he was helping Attorney General Frank Kelly in his campaign, as I was helping Dick Austin. And the two of them, Kelly and Austin, I mean, you couldn't find people who got to be closer and friends, and how people just got along with each other. And I'd never flown in an airplane before, especially one of those small airplanes where you could only put 4 people. Oh my goodness, we were traveling around the state. We were coming home one time, and I looked out my window, and out of the cloud bank I could see that tall, by City Airport, a very tall tower, whatever was out. It looked like furnace to me. I saw it, and my eyes got big. I was happy to be on the ground when we landed. But he went on, as Frank did. They both won the election that year. That was my first real victory in sense of it. And then what I found...
Were you essentially a staff person, or were you just...
I was a volunteer.
A volunteer.
I was a volunteer,
Okay.
and happy to do it.
Yep.
And the more I saw how politics worked, and it really helped to win, because we lost the first one I was in, first campaign we were in, I just started enjoying politics. And so I would continue to help folks who were running for office that I liked.
Mm-hmm.
And I enjoyed it. Still do.
Yeah, well, and you're still very active in it,
Yes.
for sure. Do I hear correctly that you were cutting some new inroads, or involved in that, with the Austin campaign, first African American running as Secretary of State? You were confronting racial realities in both going to law school, where you could go or feel comfortable, as well as where you could work. Was that reflect on that as the cutting edge issues of race at that time?
What impressed me the most during that time, despite all of the challenges that the lawyers whose shoulders I stood on, the indignities that they had to deal with, nevertheless, these were some of the most successful lawyers that you will ever want to find. And as I looked and met with them, we started when we were at the Detroit College of Law. We started the Wolverine Bar Law Student Association. And then when we graduated, we got involved with the Wolverine Bar Association as lawyers.
The Wolverine Bar Association being organized black or African American attorneys, not welcome or in the Michigan Bar and American Bar, or was there tension there?
The American Bar had a long history of discriminatory practices. The American Bar Association would not allow lawyers of color to be members. Back in 1908, a lawyer and former dean at Howard's Law School, J. Clay Smith, prolific writer. Anyway, J. Clay Smith wrote about how 3 then colored lawyers were found to be members of the ABA. When the ABA found out about it, summarily put them out and then changed the application so that if you wanted to join the American Bar, you had to list your ethnicity.
When was this?
1908. And so anytime that somebody wanted to join the American Bar, and if members of the legal community did not know that person, they would go to the law office of that person to look at them to make sure that they were not a person of color. That changed in 1943 when they changed their application. And I believe that the first person of color to join the American Bar was William Coleman, who was clerking then for Mr. Justice Felix Frankfurter, who insisted, urged, and made him join the American Bar Association. And then others around the country, unknown to me who they were, but started to join. And so when I was in law school, I joined the law student division because I wanted to find out more about what lawyers did. So I was in the Wolverine Bar Law Student section, and I was in the the law student division of the ABA, trying to find out as much as I could. Donald Campbell, the professor I mentioned earlier, before I graduated from law school, just as I was ready to graduate, asked me to come by his office, and he said, "Dennis, what I've observed is that we've had some very bright and talented law students here. But after they graduate, what I see and observe is that it's a natural inclination and that they gravitate to the black bar, in this case the Wolverine Bar. And I would urge you to consider doing both. I would urge you to consider being involved in the White Bar or the Detroit Bar Association, State Bar of Michigan. And the way you can distinguish yourself, because we've got about 17,000 lawyers. We've got about 42,000 now, I think. But we've got about 17,000 lawyers. You ought to think about writing from time to time. So I thanked him for his advice, promptly joined the Wolverine Bar Association, and met John Kersel, who was a lawyer here at Dickinson Wright. And John Kersel got me involved with the Judicial Qualifications Committee of the Detroit Bar Association, and get involved with the Young Lawyers section of the Detroit Bar Association. Now it's called Barristers, but then it was the Young Lawyers.
The judicial qualifications, you would be reviewing candidates for judicial positions.
Who were seeking to be elected to whether it's Supreme Court, Circuit Court, Common Pleas Court at the time, etc. And I really enjoyed it, and the politics of it all and the like, and I really enjoyed it. And so John got me involved there, and I ran the chairs, became chair of the Detroit Young Lawyer Section. And then I got involved and became a member of the council of the Young Lawyer Section of the State Bar of Michigan, went on to become president of the Wolverine Bar, and today you've got black bars all across the state. We're in Lansing, in Ann Arbor, Flint, Grand Rapids, and it's, statewide you have a number of different black bar associations, so things have evolved.
You eventually became the first African American to head the Michigan and the American Bar Association.
I think I was the 50th president of the State Bar of Michigan. I was president from 1984 to 1985. I was president of the National Bar Association from 1983 to 84, left that and went into the State Bar of Michigan.
Okay.
And then ultimately in 2002, after I stepped down from being mayor in December 31 of 2001, in February of 2002, I was nominated to become president-elect of the American Bar Association, was so elected in August of that year, and in 2003, 2004, I was president of the American Bar.
How did you wind up in the state Supreme Court? You mentioned you had met and got to know Jim Blanchard. He then became governor. You first met him when you were working on the Austin campaign, and he was working on the Kelly campaign.
Met him and was really delighted with what I saw in his energy and the like. There were a lot of things that I thought were compatible about both of us. And we sort of remained in touch. And then when I heard that he was thinking about running for Congress, I volunteered. It wasn't in my city,
Right.
but I volunteered because I liked and respected who Jim Blanchard was, what I thought he was doing, and he was someone, in my view, that was a role model for a lot of folks, including me. And here's somebody who's now running for and had a real good shot at being the elected as a United States congressman at a very young age. He got elected and still stayed in touch, and I maintained my interest in Democratic politics in terms of helping other candidates run. I was helpful to Blair Moody the first time he ran, and then lost, and then ran and won. When former Governor G. Mena Williams announced that he was going to run, I helped when he was being nominated by the party, and then helped after his election. Thomas Giles Kavanaugh, just enjoyed helping candidates. And
These were all volunteer.
Always, yeah. John Conyers, and I ran former Judge George Crockett's campaign when he ran to win. I was his campaign manager when he ran to replace Charles Diggs after Congressman Diggs had his challenges and it opened up the seat. And so I ran his campaign. I ran Mayor Coleman Young's first re-election campaign. The campaign director was Bob Millender, and he asked me to be the campaign manager.
I think I didn't know that until yesterday. I had not connected you with the Coleman Young campaign. It was his first re-election campaign. Right?
Yes, because Bob ran his campaign for in 1973. But interestingly enough, I was running Ed Bell's campaign for mayor in 1973. We all thought that because there was a state law, state statute, that said that if you were a member of the judiciary or if you were a member of the legislature, while if you were in the House, you could run for Senate. If you're in the Senate, you could run for the House. But if you ran for an office outside of that, you had to resign 1 year before the primary election. Same thing if you were a judge, you wanted to run for something outside of the judiciary, you'd have to resign and then run to be eligible to run. And so there was just no way that Coleman Young, who didn't announce, was going to be able to run. And so there are a lot of us who wanted to make a statement. We thought the city of Detroit, while it was still very largely majority white as a city, that we thought the time was ripe for a person of color that could run and win. And we spent a year preparing. We went to different cities around the country. I remember going and meeting with briefly with Mayor Sam Massell in Atlanta, spent a lot of time with Maynard Jackson, who was the vice mayor, went out to San Francisco to meet with Mayor Alioto's folks, went to a couple other cities to take a look at what they were doing and how they were solving and dealing with their various problems. And so when the campaign started, we announced and we were off and running. When we were making good progress. And then the Michigan Supreme Court, led by an opinion of Chief Justice John Swainson.
Who challenged? Who brought the challenge?
I think Bob Millender and Coleman Young made the challenge.
They wanted to clear
and
the
they
record.
and they knocked the statute out because it was too late at that time for him to run. Knocked the statute out. He ran, and of course we got our clocks clean. Ed Bell and us, and I remember walking behind somebody's home out in Palmer Woods, and here I am, a rookie, trying to deal with Bob Millender and Coleman Young, and I'm there with Ed Bell trying to talk them out. I know you can run, but why don't you not? We've done that. We've been doing this. We've been covering so many blocks. We've been passing out literature. We've been there. Can't we work it out? And they were very polite and said no.
Yes.
And so then when the election, the primary was over, it was between the chief of police, John Nichols, and State Senator Coleman Young,
Yes.
who I had a lot of respect for and admired. And might have gone the other way if I'd been asked by him early if I knew he was going to run. But it turned out that after the primary, Ed Bell got very deeply involved in the campaign and helped Coleman Young, and I was glad to volunteer. And they became best of friends. And after he first got into office, I got an appointment from Mayor Coleman Young to be on the taxi cab commission. We would take a look at the rates that taxi cab drivers could charge, and I remember doing a lot of reading, asked a lot of questions about the drop rate, and today I look at the drop rate what I get in the cabs around the country, and I won't even use like sometimes you go to some hotels and you are going back to the airport and hotels. Well, we got this car, so I said I'd rather be in a taxi. But in any event, the point is that Bob Millender asked if I would be the campaign manager, and I said yes. And it was another excellent opportunity to learn from a person who I deeply respected as a outstanding strategist.
Now, who was the opponent that time for re-election?
Ernie Brown, who was
who had been
the
on the city council.
member of city council. And the strategy from the Brown campaign was, here is somebody who is polished, who'd been from the business community, who understood the city, who was on city council, and here's somebody who's brash, who's taking on the police department, taking on other kind of things. And I suggested to Bob Millender a strategy that would undermine and cut the legs out of everything that they were trying to do in terms of making him sort of like the well-established, polished person, and someone who didn't relate to everybody. And by the time we got through, Mayor Coleman Young was walking on water, swimming, and did not get wet. And we just rolled over, and he won re-election.
Well, you suffered or got the same rap, did you not, when you were running for mayor? By
Mine was different.
some of the younger up-and-comers were saying you were not in touch with you were too much establishment.
Well, there was some of that. It basically boiled down to what I thought was the most appropriate approach to win, because if I was going to win, I wanted to win on my terms, and I wanted to win on a strategy that I thought would help the city overcome the challenges that it was facing. And so while I was on the Michigan Supreme Court, I was encouraged by a number of people to consider resigning and run for the office of mayor.
Appointed
I was appointed by Jim Blanchard.
by Blanchard, and then
Let's go back to that for a moment.
okay,
When the first Chrysler crisis hit, and Chairman and CEO Lee Iacocca was reaching out and needing help to get the appropriate financing for Chrysler for the bailout, there was Don Regal in the Senate.
congressman
And-
from the Senate at that time.
Yes.
Yeah, had been congressman from Flint.
And he switched parties from Republican to
Correct.
Democrat. And then there was Senator Carl Levin. And in the House, the real leader there was none other than Jim Blanchard. And I'm saying to myself, my goodness, look at this. And we'd had a long time serving governor, William G. Milliken, who despite the Democrats' best efforts with candidates like Sandy Levin, who now is in the United States House and is just a phenomenal congressman, Bill Fitzgerald,
Yes.
who's Senate Majority Leader, great guy, wonderful person, but so was G. Minna Williams. And he and Mayor Young got along exceedingly well. There was some belief or some kind of myth that the mayor was really not enthusiastically involved to defeat him when it came time for the governor's race, because
Now you say myth.
myth. I'll
you,
just
you
leave
think
it at
it's
that.
a myth?
I'll just leave it at that.
Oh, okay. so we,
In any event, they got along exceedingly well because Governor Milliken understood what was needed to be done and how to move the legislature to be of help to the city of Detroit. And even at a time when some legislators frankly ran not against their opponent, but they ran against the city of Detroit or ran against Mayor Young. And Governor Milliken always found a way for the two of them, and so did the mayor, for them to communicate, to talk about issues, to get things done. And if you think back, from my point of view, just as an aside, the worst thing that ever happened in the state of Michigan was term limits, because it took away institutional memory and knowledge, etc. And you had, unlike we see in today's times in the last several years, where people could not get along and trade votes and do that kind of thing. And so when Governor Milliken indicated that he was not going to run again, there were a lot of people who were thinking about lining up and running for that seat. A lot of outstanding folks, some of whom were in Congress as well. I went to Jim and said, I think you ought to go. I remember being at an event in Lorenzen at some dinner, and we just happened to be at the same table. I said, why don't you go? You can make this. You can do this. I'm sure he did it because others higher up than me would suggest it, but he then ran, and I helped him win. And he did an outstanding job as governor of the state of Michigan. And I was fortunate enough, if you might recall, Mr. Justice Jim Ryan was interested in and was nominated by the president and confirmed by the United States Senate to serve on the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, to leave the Michigan Supreme Court, which left a vacancy.
Right.
And I was finishing up as president of the State Bar of Michigan, had gone all around. And there were those who were suggesting that I might be an ideal candidate to serve on the Michigan Supreme Court. Because
To
I had
fill the Ryan vacancy.
Yes.
Yep.
And it was just a short term for 1 year, because the election was in 1986.
So you had to immediately then run.
Absolutely.
You were appointed, and then you had to immediately run because your appointment just lasted through his term.
And we had not had a person of color on the Michigan Supreme Court since Otis Smith, who was a very, very brilliant scholarly lawyer who lost to Thomas Brennan, who was on the Wayne County Circuit Court, and as the story goes, as he shared with me, he was out mowing grass, and he was called by the party and asked, can we put your name in to run against Otis Smith? And he said yes, and I'll quickly, but he said yes, he was nominated. He beat Otis Smith, and back in 1967, United States Senator Phil Hart had the dilemma of who to choose to appoint to the Eastern District of Michigan. Would it be lawyer Damon J. Keith, or former Supreme Court Justice, former auditor, or not, whatever? There was another office that Otis had served in and did a remarkable job. And Phil Hart chose Damon Keith. And of course, that was not, I don't think, a real tough loss. And here's what I mean. Otis Smith, because of his tremendous talent and wisdom and a great lawyer, was chosen by General Motors to become the first African American general counsel of a Fortune 500 company, the largest company in the world, and he did a remarkable job. So both Damon Keith and Otis Smith did remarkable work in providing role models that you couldn't ask for better people. But when the opportunity came about, I was asked if I would be willing to serve as a member of the Michigan Supreme Court, and I said yes. And Governor Blanchard made that appointment or nomination in November of 1985, and when Mr. Justice Jim Ryan transferred over after the first of the year to the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, I was sworn in.
So you experienced appointment initially.
Yes.
And then
Ran
immediately
as an
ran. The ongoing debate, as current as this year when Justice Ryan and Justice Kelly convened a judicial selection reform committee, the debate has been ongoing about appointment versus election. How should we select Supreme Court justices? Do you feel strongly about that?
I will tell you, I can understand why both would come down with the recommendation that their task force came up with. I understand it because the when I ran, for example, I think we raised about $350,000.
Tell us the year again. Is
1986.
86.
Dean Robb raised about $450,000. Dean Robb was the
Right.
other Democratic nominee.
He was an attorney in the upper part of the state.
Traverse City.
Traverse City.
Then they had former United States Senator Robert Griffin.
Yes.
Then there was Judge McKenzie, who was on the circuit. There was 24 of us who were running for 2 spots. And I had great people helping me. Because I've been around the state as state bar president, speaking in different bars, I had the bar association, not bars, bar
Right,
associations.
yes.
That helped me a great deal. And there was not any acrimony between the candidates. Now, I will say that when I first got appointed, that the Michigan Chamber of Commerce took issue with my candidacy because I came from a plaintiff's law firm, Scharfus, Christensen, and Archer. And they felt that I would be too liberal to this, to that, and the other. But there was a person that I had met and come to know, and thus he knew me, by the name of Richard Van Dusen, who was a former partner in Dickinson Wright, where I was ultimately a partner in the scheme of things. And Richard Van Dusen was also chair of the Detroit Chamber of Commerce. And because he knew me, he invited me to come up to the Mackinac Policy Conference. I was given an opportunity to speak before a plenary session.
That conference could be characterized as the business retreat annually of Detroit and corporate businesses
Yes.
in Michigan.
And that was something, by the way, I became chair of the Detroit Regional Chamber, 2006, 2007, after I left office as mayor. But Richard Van Dusen gave me an opportunity to come before the Detroit Regional Chamber. And I was able to, through him and through the chamber, meet a lot of different business organizations. And they were satisfied that I gathered that I was safe, I was okay, and they could get behind it. And so I was able to win. And I won an 8-year seat. But we experienced in the city businesses leaving the city. You might recall back then it was jackets and gym shoes that kids were fighting over. Some were being killed over to take their jackets and gym shoes, certain style of jackets, certain style of gym shoes. And so I was asked, why don't you consider running? I really enjoyed being a member of the Michigan Supreme Court. I served with Mr. Chief Justice G. Mena Williams and Jim Brickley, who's a former lieutenant governor. And by the way, Jim Brickley was the one who, when he was running for governor, you might recall, he tried to advance and get petitions signed to appoint, for whoever the governor would be, appoint the Supreme Court, Court of Appeals, education posts, etc. Because, you know, U of M, Michigan State, Wayne State, State Board, you run and nominated by your respective parties. And so he tried to get signatures, and he couldn't do it. Didn't win the election, but then he was appointed to the, and won or was appointed to the Michigan Supreme Court. And to go back to your original question in terms of Justice Ryan and Justice Kelly and their views, Governor John Engler was in a position to appoint a number of justices because of vacancies on the Michigan Supreme Court. And he did that. And they had a uniform, it was believed or observed or documented, whatever you myth or whatever the case may be, that they had a philosophical belief that was anti-plaintiff, pro-business. And there were a number of cases that came before them that, in their view, on the basis of the facts and the law, that decisions were made, and when you look at the decisions, the decisions was consistent with a pro-business point of view and an anti-plaintiff point of view. And so we finally got in the state of Michigan to the point where there was, I believe, 3 who were running for election at the same time. It just turned out, happened to be that way. Somebody was short term, or I should fill in the vacancy, and then 2 who were running, I think, for a full term of office. And they were all nominated by their party, the Republican Party. They had 3 candidates from the Democratic Party that ran against each other. And I think $12 million plus were spent. A lesser amount by the individual candidates themselves, but the business community had a huge, because they saw the advantage of having people who they felt understood their point of view and was in the best interest of the state of Michigan. And so they raised a lot of money and supported the 3. And the ads.
So this was a PAC supported by the business community, but it was not a PAC administered or supported by the candidate him
That's
or herself.
exactly right.
It was independent.
Independent of them. And the same as it relates to the Democratic candidates.
Yes.
And those who raised money supporting the Democratic candidates, the PACs, they had some real interesting ads. I can still remember to this day one ad talking about, don't worry about what are we going to do about insurance? Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. We've got 3, and you'd see the animation of 3 people jumping up and down and going in and pulling out money and all that kind of stuff where they were supposedly being paid. And it was a vitriolic, very nasty campaign.
Right.
The 3 Republicans won. And then it was about that time that I was coming in as president-elect of the American Bar. And the then president of the American Bar asked if I would meet with, because they had an initiative in the ABA, let's tone down the nastiness of the elections. We had a meeting here at Wayne State University, called in both the Republican and Democratic state party chairs to see if we could not get an agreement to reduce the negativity and the like. Because it was not only here in Michigan, it was in Texas, all over the place. It was just, it seemed like it was just something that everybody was doing. And it was not good for the rule of law, and it was not good for the respect of the judiciary. And I will tell you that I was very pleased with what I saw here in Michigan. They toned it down. Then it popped back up again. And so that's why I believe that the 2 justices in their commission, and by the way, the commission was made up also of plaintiff and defense lawyers.
Yes.
Who also agree. So it was bipartisan across the board, philosophically balanced and the like, and they came to that conclusion. I remember, however, a person that I consider to be not only a mentor but a friend, Mr. Chief Justice G. Mena Williams, was always of the opinion that the voters better understood what
Yes.
they felt was important than anybody else, and therefore he was ultimately opposed to taking away that vote of the people.
Seems to me, injecting my own perspective, that you get, or are more likely to get, public ownership of the system of jurisprudence if there is an elected judiciary, or at least there's that opportunity, if somehow we can communicate with people and answer the questions they need to have answered. You know, that these ads don't characterize the system, but I don't know how you do that. It's naive to say, let's be nice and stay on point. But doesn't election provide greater ownership, at least, of the system?
Using your word, Lynn, I think it provides the opportunity. In reality, our media, press, both TV, written, print, etc., has never really provided an opportunity to appreciate and know the candidates, where they are, what they stand for, and to elevate in the minds of our voters how important the judiciary happens to be, and how what makes this country, frankly, so different and so much greater than everybody else is the respect for the rule of law and democracy. Madam Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, in an opinion, I'll paraphrase, and simply said that the United States Supreme Court does not have an army to enforce its opinions. We count upon the citizens to respect the rule of law. Well, the people who best share with the public how to respect the rule of law, and if you disagree with a decision made by any court, whether it's in the state of Michigan, the Michigan Supreme Court, or the United States Supreme Court, is to go either to the House and Senate of your state or House and Senate of the federal government and seek relief, etc. And so, since that is not something that is available, and because judges can't give, and frankly, neither can members of the Senate or the House, they can't give people jobs. It's not patronage, and they can't appoint people to do things as a president or a governor or a mayor can do. And so it is the only thing that lawyers could do, or judges running for office could do, is to say, I will be fair and impartial. And if asked, well, if the issue of abortion comes up while you're how would you rule? I'm sorry, I can't answer that question, because if I do, the other side would be able to file a motion asking me to recuse or remove myself from that decision process because I have a preconceived notion about how the outcome should come. And so I can't answer that question. Then there was a United States Supreme Court case, I think was either Wisconsin, Minnesota,
Yes.
I think it was the White case, I think, that the Supreme Court said that you could respond in certain instances. But even though the United States Supreme Court has said you could do it, most do not. And so I come back to this. Until the media gives full attention to the office and what that office does and can do, whether it's probate, circuit, district court, the Michigan Supreme Court, Court of Appeals, and until they help educate. And the Bar Association tries to do it. And frankly, more lawyers than anybody else have an interest in who's serving on the bench, because lawyers have a chance to know who that person is, what they're about, so that most elections in our state as far as the judiciary is concerned, whether it's the more, and it's more for the Supreme Court than Court of Appeals, Circuit, etc. Whoever heads the ticket in the state, if that person, whatever party, or persons, whatever party, wins that state, they carry with them the educational board seats, and they also carry with them whoever's running generally for Michigan Supreme Court. Now, every incumbent, in this last election, for example, Mr. Justice Markman, Mr. Justice Zera, they had what is called the incumbency designation, meaning under their names, if they timely file, and everybody does, whether you're running for district court, etc., you're able to list your office. And so in this case, under Mr. Justice Markman or Mr. Justice Zera would be Justice of the Michigan Supreme Court. There was another, in effect, open seat. And no one who was nominated by the Republican or the Democratic Party had any designation under them. And so with one of the best campaigners in this state that I know, United States Senator Debbie Stabenow being at the head of the ticket, along with a person who was running for re-election and who had been very helpful to the automotive industry and others who benefited by decisions of him being president of the United States, you had a very good campaigner in President Barack Obama. They led the ticket. And when they led the ticket, all of those persons nominated by the Democratic Party for the State Board of Ed, Board of Governors at Wayne, Board of Regents at University of Michigan, Board of Trustees at Michigan State, they all won.
Yes.
And so did Bridget Mary McCormack, a person nominated by the Democratic Party.
One of the things that the task force that former Justice Ryan and Justice Kelly chaired, one of the things they came out for very strongly was, in an elected system such as we have, we would benefit greatly from a diverse, not only attorneys, but more broadly based lay people as well. I'll call them screening committees and so on. You had experience, you said, in a bar association role of screening. How do you react to that recommendation of a more broad-based group of people who look at potential
I think if you were going to go to that approach, I think that's very helpful. I think if you take a look at what occurs in Michigan for a vacancy in our federal courts, in our trial courts, if there's a United States Senator of the same party of the President, then in this case Carl Levin, as United States Senator, will form a commission. And that committee or commission would first review all of the applications. Then from the applications, they'll determine how many they want to interview. And from those who are interviewed, they will recommend 2 names for every vacancy that's there. In this case, we now have 2 vacancies coming up on the Eastern District. Judge Battani and Judge Edmonds are seeking, or have chosen to go senior status, so it opens up 2 vacancies. So there will be 4 people probably recommended to Senator Levin, who also, because he believes in doing that, sharing that with the input with Senator Debbie Stabenow, then they'll make a recommendation to the president. And that works, and it works well. And I will tell you one of the things that I learned being chair of the Judicial Qualifications Committee of the State Bar, and that is when you fill out a very long, intensive application, one that I had to do myself when I was nominated by Governor Blanchard. I had to fill it out, disclose everything, and then you put down who you would choose as references. if the committee chooses to call somebody, folks would put down names of folks that they thought would be very supportive. Never called them, apparently. And lawyers are very honest in this extent. I mean, they want somebody on the bench who will do a very fine job and be fair, etc. So if they know, if that lawyer, if you list him as a reference and you call that person and say, I asked you in confidence, this person being considered for this position, etc. What do you think about their work habits, etc., etc. If they know anything that is negative, they will lay it out and it will come out. So my exposure in terms of seeing that done firsthand is that it works.
You went from the court to to civilian life for a couple of years. Did you go from the court to run for mayor? Was that in your thinking at that time?
It wasn't my thinking. I really enjoyed public service. For those of us who are long in the tooth, like my friend, Mr. Justice, Mr. Chief Justice G. Mena Williams, or Judge Damon Keith, and so many others that I've met. For us, some of us, the practice of law, or being a lawyer, sometimes is called the public service. I enjoyed serving on the Michigan Supreme Court. It was a great collegial body. When I left the court, Madam Chief Justice Dorothy Comstock Riley was our Chief Justice. I got along well with all of the members of the court. And I enjoyed being one of 7 serving the people of the state of Michigan. But I kept reading about kids at that time who were injuring and sometimes even killing other kids over jackets and gym shoes. And then about the businesses that were leaving the city of Detroit, about crime as it was starting to edge up. I felt that I could probably make a difference if somehow I was successful to run and then win. But I also felt that in order to run, I would need to resign from the Michigan Supreme Court because of the provision that had not been overturned for judges, 1. But 2, I wanted to ask everybody, what do you want? What do you expect from the next mayor, whoever it is? And I found that if I needed to ask business people that question, in many instances, while the business people I would speak to about that question would not be ever before the court, their companies would be. Mm-hmm. And there is a higher ethical standard for those of us who serve on the bench. It's called the judicial canons. And we have to avoid even the appearance of impropriety. And so I resigned from the Michigan Supreme Court and I went to the University of Michigan to meet with President Jim Duderstadt. I could have gone to Wayne, but I just felt that I'd assumed that I was going to be running against the mayor, and I assumed that his appointees who serve in different departments would make it tough on anybody who would support someone who was going to run against the mayor. So I went to the University of Michigan, and I asked if he could ask members of his staff, not his staff, but professors that might have an interest in working with me, to see if we couldn't find the answers to about 6 or 7 different questions. And I couldn't promise him that I was going to run, but if I did run, I would certainly acknowledge the help that I received from the university and the individual professors who helped. And he came back to me with some names, and I used a term that I learned from working on the Law School Accreditation Committee in the section of legal education and admission to the bar. They became, in effect, my laboring oars. They were able to encourage people from other cities who had similar challenges as we did in Michigan, while I was able to go to members of our community here in the neighborhood, I could ask them, what would you want done? I mean, without sounding too glib, any fool could tell you what the problems were. I wanted some solutions because I wanted the people of this city to know that if they voted for me, here is where I want to go. Here's where I'd like to take us. And so we answered 6 questions. Another person who was very helpful to me was Phil Power. Phil's wife, God rest her soul, was very instrumental and very helpful to me when I ran to keep my seat on the Michigan Supreme Court. Sarah was just outstanding. And I met Phil then, and
Now Sarah was she on the Board of Regents?
I think she was at the time.
Sarah Power.
Yeah. And, but she was just a very knowledgeable, warm person and wanted to be of help. And I needed all the help that I could get. Because remember, you know, when you look at the city of Detroit, that's one thing in terms of people of color. You take a look at the state, our numbers are very small and de minimis at the time. And so I went to Phil and said, here's what I'm doing, and I'd love your help. He said, I'd help you this way. You can come and meet in my office. And so that was, we went to the Observer's office. It was on 696, and it was in between Detroit and Ann Arbor. And so that's where we would meet, at Phil's office. And we came up with a document that I think was about 56 pages long that we wrote. I had a lot of help. I had help from Nettie Seabrooks, who was with General Motors at the time, Al Lucarelli, who was the managing partner of Ernst & Young, who moved here from Atlanta, and a friend of mine wanted me to meet him. And I was on the court at the time, but wanted me to meet him when he came. I was very impressed with him, liked him and his wife a lot. And then Mike Frank, who was the executive director of the State Bar of Michigan. And we finished the document. I sent out over 1,000 people, including the Mayor Young, and say, here's where I think the city ought to go, and let it go. And then I went to the News, the Free Press, and the Michigan Chronicle, and met with the editors and reporters. And when nobody would step up and say, I will run, I announced my candidacy. And my announcement had a very huge surprise to it. The huge surprise was the longtime friend and lawyer of the mayor, George Crockett, standing up saying, I know him, etc., and I'm supporting him, and I'm calling on my friend Mayor Young not to run again. It turned out that Mayor Young did not run. He supported Art Blackwell in the primary and Sharon McPhail in the general. The knock on me was, from that quarter, was that because I believed in building bridges, we in the city were going outside the city and spending our money outside because we didn't have, we'd lost all our department stores that we had downtown, and the last one from Saks left from the West Grand Boulevard address up there, Midtown. And we didn't have any department stores. So we'd go outside the city to spend our money. Folks from the suburbs would come in because we had great sporting teams. We had the Tigers, and we had the Red Wings. The Lions were playing out in Pontiac, and the Pistons were out in now Auburn Hills. And they'd come in for the great cultural things that we had, DIA, come in for the art museum, for the entertainment. We have more theater seats, and only the city of New York's got more theater seats than the city of Detroit. That's not a well-known fact. But so people come up, but then they would leave right away and go out. So I wanted to build bridges, and I wanted to see if we could get a better transportation system. And we needed jobs. But I also knew and believed that jobs, the need for jobs doesn't create jobs. Businesses create jobs, and thus you've got to work with business to provide the kind of incentive, motivation, attractiveness about your city to attract business to come in. Turns out that I was fortunate to be elected, and nobody gave Detroit a prayer to win the empowerment zone. We won the empowerment zone. Governor John Engler saw what the empowerment zone was doing, came up with the Renaissance zones, which we utilized to attract businesses. We used the smart zones that he created to attract or to start up, which is now Tech Town, where we've got a number of businesses that are developing and the like. And we opened up the door. The knock on me was I was going to sell the city's jewels. They had me selling the water department. They had me selling the DIA, etc. But after I got in, and people saw what I was doing and my intent, that was never an issue.
Right. You had a good time as mayor.
We attracted $20.2 billion of new business into the city. We had the empowerment zone, the Renaissance zone, and the other things that we attracted business with. We were written up in the newspapers around the United States, whether it was the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, LA Times, Baltimore papers, Chicago papers. People were talking about the comeback city. I mean, we had new development downtown. We had 2 ballparks. We had 3 temporary casinos. We had new housing going up. We had a tech town because General Motors, when they moved away from their Fleetwood Cadillac plant, developed an area, cleaned it out so that we could add new businesses out there. And these businesses, a number of them, were businesses owned by people of color. And it just created new jobs. Vinnie Johnson was hired people and got them off the welfare rolls. A lot of different kinds of things. I mean, same thing, Ron Hall, John James, and everybody participated. In the empowerment zone, our financial institutions, which when I was running for mayor, a number of businesses, especially businesses of color, would say, banks won't loan us money. So I went to Detroit Renaissance and said, would you all come up with a $50 million fund that you can take an equity position in, whatever you want to do, but make sure the capital is available for businesses of color as to support loans, etc., that they needed to grow their business. The financial institutions led by Brenda Snyder, who was a vice president of Comerica Bank at the time, they came up with $1.2 billion that they committed to lend over 10 years. The automotives, Ford, Chrysler, General Motors, said we will commit to provide $600 million worth of new business over 10 years. The first call I got was from my man Bob Eaton, who was the chairman and CEO of Chrysler. He called me from Argentina and said, Mr. Mayor, would you be interested in having a $750 million engine plant? Yes, absolutely. I mean, I was excited about it. And he had another plant. General Motors followed. Ford Motor Company got involved through Wayne Doran in terms of causing some business to happen with John James. And then the voters of the state of Michigan said that they would entrust the city of Detroit to have up to 3 privately owned casinos. We were able to get a new baseball stadium that, thanks to the voters and others, that provided a new baseball stadium for our Tigers playing called Comerica Park. And then Bill Ford, who I had met with, and Bill Ford was the person who was assigned to work with the city of Detroit by the chairman and CEO of Ford Motor Company at the time, because focus was other. So he and I would have lunch. I would go out, talk to him. He'd come down to Detroit, have lunch with me in a little private area that we had in the mayor's office to talk about the city of Detroit and what Ford Motor Company could do and the other things and the like. And I got a call from him one day, and he said, "Mr. Mayor, I'm having a tough time with trying to work out something fair and reasonable with the city of Pontiac. If we can't work it out, would you be interested in having the Detroit Lions come back to the city of Detroit?" Yes, I was at it again. And so we wound up with the two stadia. And then I had a very brilliant corporation counsel by the name of Phyllis James. Phyllis observed that we had, when I was running, that there was a challenge to the market share program or affirmative action program that Mayor Young had in place. It was working quite well, but it was challenged because it did not meet the Richmond versus Croson ruling of the United States Supreme Court, something that Mr. Bradford, William Bradford Reynolds, who is in the Justice Department under President Reagan, caused for settled cases to be reopened and went before the Supreme Court. It did not meet the test, so we had no affirmative action program. And you had to meet the disparage impact initiative to satisfy Richmond versus Croson. And there's no way with a city that had an African-American mayor, majority of city council African-American, all department heads across the board, you couldn't make that case. She came up with the fact that there were so many businesses in the city of Detroit that we came up with Executive Order 4. Executive Order 4 required all of our city departments to do 30% of their business with Detroit-based businesses. Because so many of the businesses had left the city of Detroit, businesses of color had no place to go but to remain here. And so they were able to be very successful in doing a lot of outstanding work. And I can point to a lot of different buildings and things that they were involved in, because the two stadia, the Ford family and the Ilitch family, the three different casinos said they would, as did CompuWare, when they moved into the city of Detroit, said they would come. They had adopted Executive Order 4. So we had a lot of growth during that time. We were looked as a comeback city. We had a federal government with President Bill Clinton, Vice President Gore, with people like Robert Rubin and Henry Cisneros and Gene Sperling, who were strong advocates, along with Henry Cisneros, for cities. And so they had a program and an approach because Governor Clinton had met with the U.S. Conference of Mayors to understand what cities needed, so he provided tools for a hand up rather than a hand out to allow cities to start doing things to help themselves. And I would take advantage of every COPS program. The COPS program was grants that would be available to hire police officers, and you had to commit to keep them on. And so after the money, for them ran out, we had a reduction of crime every year that I was mayor. We balanced the budget every year. We had a modest rainy day fund every year. And so we made a lot of changes, but I will tell you, it takes a lot out of you. I was spending 16, 18-hour days. I'd go on vacation and just to sort of think fast forward or look backward, when I became mayor, for example, we didn't have computers in our office. We had rotary dial telephones. Yep. And so when I was on vacation, I would have a portable fax machine. I'd have a pager, a cell phone, and a laptop to try to stay in touch with the office. And I had to come back a couple of times. I came back because we got down to short strokes, and we needed an agreement between the Ilitches and the Fords to put something on the Wayne County ballot, and it had to be done with a certain. So I came back from vacation to do that. I came back because of a school strike, and I wanted to get our kids back in school as soon as possible, so I left vacation. Those are the kind of things that you do. And then you, regrettably, you also have threats against your life and against your family's life because of the things that you do. The toughest thing that I ever had to do as mayor, just as an aside, was going to the hospital and meeting with the families of the police officers who were injured or killed in the line of duty, and then to go to their funerals and to speak and to see their children and their family out there in front of you. It was, I could never get through without showing a sense of emotion, those kind of things.
The perception of you, and I appreciate the insight you've given us. The perception by the name droppers, political name droppers, and so on, was that you should be thinking about becoming governor, or you should be thinking about becoming a member of the cabinet, the Clinton cabinet, or something. Because I think because you made yourself present, you were there, you were involved with people at the state and federal level on behalf of the city. Were those ever attractive ideas or options?
There were options. Right after President Clinton won re-election, I was called by a cabinet officer and talked to me about 3 different cabinet positions. And I said, thank you, but I haven't finished my first term as mayor. My commitment is to the city. I still want to be and will be supportive of the president, whatever he does, but I got to stay with my city. So I turned down those opportunities. And as it relates to the office of governor, after I left the mayor's office, my numbers were still high in terms of favorability. And when it was clear that the governor was term limited, I'm talking about Governor Granholm, I was asked by a number of close friends that had been very supportive of me when I was mayor if I would look at the office of governor. And I thought about it. And I said, I'll look. I had in mind that there were 35 different meetings, as I penciled down, that I wanted to have. And it was so early, it allowed me to do what was important to me. I wanted to meet with these groups to ask them, I'm coming to you, I want to know what you think. I want to know what you want or expect from the next governor.
Building the similar kind of lead up you did as you were looking at becoming mayor.
And so I would meet and ask them questions. They were shocked that somebody would come and ask them what they thought, because typically when people come to meet with them, they come and say, I'm running for this and I would like your support and here's what I want from you, etc. When I walked away from those meetings, I got the support and stuff that I wasn't even asking for, but there was commitments because they appreciated somebody who thought enough and respected them enough that they would ask them what they thought. After I'd gone through about 20 meetings, there was something else in the back of my mind, to be very candid. I love this state. This is a very outstanding, unique state made up of a lot of different wonderful people, a lot of different backgrounds. While we had statewide elected officers of color, myself being one on the Supreme Court, Conrad Mallett, who followed, Bob Young, who followed. We've had outstanding folks like Richard Austin and others who've been elected to office. We've never had a governor or a person of color win this state. when President Barack Obama became president and won the state of Michigan, that took away any need for me to say another word or do anything. The other thing that scared me to death was if I ran, I thought I might have a good shot at winning the Democratic nomination. I had a very good working relationship with labor. Steve Yokich, Ron Gittelfinger, the folks
Presidents of UAW, right?
President Jim Hoffa, Bill Black, the folks with SEIU and ASME, etc. I had a good working relationship. I mean, I always had an open door policy when I was mayor, but I was a very strong mayor in terms of I wasn't going to give away the store.
Yes.
But I also had a working relationship with business because we need business to create the jobs. It's so important, and you've got to have that working relationship. I would meet with the Detroit Renaissance almost monthly. I would meet quarterly I had to encourage them to meet the Detroit Regional Chamber because I wanted to know what they were thinking. I wanted them to know what we were trying to do. And they were very helpful in getting things done, and we worked together. So I had a good working relationship. But the thing that scared me to death is, what if I won? And I'm not saying that just in terms of being, of being cocky or anything, but I will tell you, the difference between being mayor and being governor is, I work 16, 17 hours a day, but I could always get home at night. In our state, we've got areas of our state that it takes you 12 hours to drive to. And you say, well, why don't you fly? Because voters want you to sacrifice and not appear to be taking advantage of things. If you remember, Governor Engler, winning that last election, took that nickel, had his mother come on at the end after the campaign going back and forth, and he's talking about, I'm going to get rid of the airplanes, etc.
Yes.
I couldn't get home at night. I would always want to be the kind of governor if I ran and won. If somebody was having a problem in Marquette or Port Huron or Cassopolis or any place in Michigan, if I thought the governor's office could be of help, I would want to be there. And I couldn't get home at night. And I had have two right now, outstanding grandchildren, 4 and 7. I don't want to give that up. And I enjoy what I'm doing. So I announced it. I looked at it. I was satisfied that somebody could win it. That was a Democrat. But it was not going to be me. So I didn't run. I will also tell you that I was asked by the Obama administration to consider a position, and I thanked them very much and said, no, I want to be able to help him get reelected in 2012. And then this year I was asked if I wanted to do something, and it was exciting to do. It'd been a lot of fun to do it. I said, I would rather wait and let him choose somebody else, because it's important to me that he be reelected, because you've had so few presidents that you can't, well, I'll say that, let me reword that or recast that. Not everybody who's a president gets reelected. And it was important for me that the first person of color who won the privilege and the right to be president of the United States, that he be reelected. Because it's so, and then when you start thinking about how children can look at this person on television, children who are not getting a good education, maybe not motivated to get a good education, that their mothers and grandmothers and aunts and uncles and others can say, do you know who that is? That's the President of the United States. You can be President of the United States. They're intangibles, but they're important intangibles, enough so that I wanted to make sure that I did whatever I could to get him reelected. So I said, I'll pass. If you want me to do it next time, I'll be glad to do it. But right now, I want to get him reelected.
So in that sense, the second term became almost more important than the first for the president.
Because if he was not reelected, I mean, I don't care who the president is. President Ronald Reagan was elected twice, and you've had George Herbert Walker Bush was not reelected. Then you had his son, who was reelected twice, and you had Jimmy Carter, reelected but was not reelected. I did not want any negativity going to the president and say, see, you can't elect somebody like that because. And so that was very important. Plus, frankly, he was doing a great job, in my view. And I thought he really meant what he said. He wanted to work across the aisle, but it takes two people to work across the aisle. But he keeps trying.
I want to thank you for having spent this time with us. You've been very gracious with your time and your insights and your candor. Appreciate this opportunity to talk with you. I hope we've given people a chance to know you better. I certainly feel that has happened here.
Well, Lynn, thank you very much. And I want to thank former Governor Blanchard and our former ambassador to Canada and my friend for thinking about doing something like this and causing you, of all great people, to be the interviewer. You have a tremendous track record of your own, and you also have a reputation that you, once leaving office, of reaching out and wanting to create a bipartisan kind of atmosphere where you've actually taught and influenced a lot of young people who are not young today, but you taught a lot of young people to think about running for office because it's so important that they run for office, and it is important that they appreciate the world of politics. So let me thank you for being the interviewer, for coming out.
Thank you much.